Okay, start recording. Katie, you'll take care of the polls, right? You'll launch it when you need it.
Mhm.
Cool.
Okay, welcome everyone to Data for Good, how data impacts my life, data ethics and privacy. My name is Marie. I'm the CIO and co-founder of Data 360 and on the board of advisors for Data for Good. And today I am hosting the session with Rachel Whaley from LA Tech for Good and Van Jones from Vocalytics. Today we're going to talk about how we how data become every part of our life and a bigger part of our policies and community. Rachel and Van, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Marie. My name is Rachel Whaley, and I'm here with LA Tech for Good. I think I see some friends of LA Tech for Good here joining us. But if you're not familiar with us, we are working on the intersection of technology and social impact in Los Angeles and beyond. So really excited to be here tonight. We've been doing some programming lately around data ethics, data equity. It's an area I'm really passionate about. And so I'm excited to speak with you all tonight.
Awesome, Rachel. Excited to be joined by you. Really looking forward to this panel here. And I think we're going to have some great findings in data privacy and ethics. I'm Van West, the founder and CEO of Vocalytics, longtime entrepreneur, I'd say serial entrepreneur. I've had a few of my own ventures, been a part of some hyper growth ventures along my journey, and really just excited to share around data privacy and data ethics today. As my latest company, Vocalytics, we monitor ambient background sounds for better care delivery in healthcare, as well as safety and security notifications, events, alerts, and trends within commercial real estate environments. So I think from a passive listening perspective, I've definitely got a great foundation for understanding privacy.
Awesome. And Data for Good, we're Southern California based. We think globally, act locally. We have representatives from various community organizations and corporations striving to use data and technology to do better and give back to the greater community. We are directed by Savage D'Souza, who's our founder, who leverages a network of private and public leaders to help organizations harness the power of data to make more informed and better decisions to benefit society. So let's get started. So data is becoming a bigger part of our policy and community conversations every day, but it's a tool. And as a tool to fight, as a tool in the fight for social justice, data can help redesign systems where bias occurs, reclaim overlooked histories, and identify patterns of oppression. And at the same time, data collection can raise ethical concerns and questions about how to best address potential threats to society or to privacy. So we want to talk a little bit about how data explore how data is affecting us personally, our online presence, our digital footprints, the ethical challenges in modern data practice of data science, including data privacy, personalization, and targeting algorithms and online experimentation, and how we can balance innovation and regulation and move from compliance-driven to ethics-driven, and what it'll take to design social technological systems that work. So one of the things we want to talk about first is, I want to ask Rachel and Van, what do you see as the biggest risk or number one priority for protecting our personal data?
I'm happy to start on this one. I think that there are potentially a variety of ways to answer this question. I see the biggest risk as broadly inequities. I think we have seen in data and technology so many examples of harmful things that are happening, whether it's an algorithm, whether it's how a particular technology is designed, and whether it's accessible to individuals or not. And so to me, as I'm looking at these events that happen, a few years ago, there's an example of Amazon having an algorithm to sort through resumes of job applicants, and they found they called it a bug in their algorithm where it was kind of filtering out, for example, applicants who had applied from a women's college. And so that's just one example of these when these things happen, the impact is not the same across everyone. It's disproportionately impacting already marginalized groups. So that happens across all identity dimensions. Gender is just one. Certainly happens across race, ability status, all sorts of other dimensions. And so to me, that is the biggest risk because it has the potential to amplify things that are already existing systemic problems. And so I think that is the highest priority to address.
Rachel,
what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to echo certain pieces of that, as I firmly agree that it really comes down to the inequities. But I think going beyond the inequities and my background really on the AI side is, parsing large data sets to understand those trends. Similar to that Amazon algorithm, it's understanding the nuances in that bias that shapes that algorithm, that guides that data flow. So, for me on my side, I agree with that side, but I also want to throw in there, it comes down to auditing those data sets and establishing and really ensuring that there's less of a bias as the algorithm grows, as those new models are deployed. So having auditing practices to really understand what's being done with your data and really having that level of transparency with the user, with the customer, with in whatever environments, I think it comes down to transparency on my side.
Do you think there's a technology to monitor the technology? Or do you think there's a people process, is it a hybrid of the two? What's gonna create balance? What do you think will make balance happen?
Are you asking on my side?
Yes, Dan.
Yeah, I do think it's a hybrid approach. I think the technology is, we have to understand as humans that the data sets exist and they're being gathered and mined every single day. So understanding, really having that perspective as an individual, that this is what's being done with my data, then we can start architecting technological tools to understand and really extrapolate those feature sets. If you look at the App Store, Apple is trying to be as transparent as possible with those privacy labels on apps now, and requiring all new developers and frankly all new submissions of apps to have those privacy labels. So I think the first step is that level of transparency in sharing, this is what information is being collected and this is how it's being used, and then having a systemic process or technology, employing technology to flag, much like a security audits.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think for me, I think there's a lot of process that can happen really quickly, right? The processes can be implemented kind of right away. And I think we'll start to see more technology in this area. To Van's point, I think a more standardized kind of auditing just kind of across industries and kind of thinking of data as its own sort of sector or industry. I think that has the potential to be really powerful. As Van mentioned, to kind of understand what's happening with algorithms, to kind of put in place some safeguards there. But I think more broadly to also just identify what's being used and if it's even appropriate. So, your algorithm could be as fair and unbiased as possible, but if you're starting from a data set that's just not appropriate for the use case, that's an issue right from the get-go, and you need to maybe consider not using that data set. And that's the type of thing that an audit or a process could find that I think a technology can't at this point. So I think that it's definitely both.
Yeah, I want to ask you too a question, because I think it'll lead into some of the other questions we were talking about, which is, who do you think should be the arbiter of truth in what is fair? Is it the government? Is it the businesses being transparent about what they call fair? Is it which is what it is now? Or is it some other citizen-based process? What do you think would bring kind of sort of peace and balance in this area? Do you think what entity is responsible for the truth?
Wow, that is a huge question, Marie. I think multiple world wars have been fought on that topic.
Yeah.
But to attempt to answer it in a Zoom panel briefly, in the data realm, I think there are different pieces of it that fall into everybody's bucket, right? So I think transparency is a piece of it, but you could have really unethical, really inequitable practices and be transparent about it, right? Transparency is absolutely not sufficient. And so I think that is definitely one piece. So if you're a business or kind of an organization thinking about data, I think being transparent about your practices is not the stopping point. I think individuals should be having some awareness of this, although I certainly don't think it all falls on their shoulders. I'm sure we'll get into the role of government more later. I have lots of thoughts on that, but I certainly think they have a role to play.
So
Yeah, I definitely couldn't agree more. On my side, I think it's all about the individual, the citizen. It's you and yourself and your data. It's being empowered by that to collectively look at the rest of us as individuals. It's citizen oriented. It's also business oriented in benefiting an industry, but having that authority, and then also obviously having government and really policy involved in that conversation. I think all three are crucial. To have an imbalance on any one of those three sides is going to do an injustice to the entire system. So I would think of it less like if you look at your FICO score today, those are technically companies, businesses that are basing your credit history, your credit worthiness, lending practices. Though it's somewhat regulated by the government, it's still technically more of a public company or a few public companies that are actually doing that. So there's only a handful of those. So I think it really comes down to, I would I would frame it and I would think about it as having a committee where everyone has an equal vote towards every given topic that's discussed. And privacy around one aspect of privacy could be one of those topics just to vote on. And I would look at it and say that you got to have an equal number of individuals, consumers, citizens, whatnot, in that first bucket, an equal number of business representatives that are obviously reputable, that understand the risks associated, and then an equal number of policymakers that have a history of not necessarily leaning on one side or the other, but a good balance, I think, between all three parties to have that influence and equal vote.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've had a very interesting time in the last year with COVID, and technology has really played a key role in that. From hospitals, I guess Chinese hospitals are using robots in the place of frontline health workers and smart imaging, and there's the GPS for social contacts and tracing, social tracing, contact tracing. So what assurances, this has been like extremely valuable in a crisis, right? But what assurances can we give that people will still have some kind of privacy or anonymity or a way to turn it off? Or how do you guys think that should work? How does that process really play out in society now that we have all kinds of different things happening? I mean, who needs weather disasters, right? People are stuck in floods and tornadoes back east. So how do we balance that particular issue, the idea of a crisis?
I can hop in on this one just real fast. So, I look at COVID, I look at the pandemic, I look at the time that we've all lived through in the last year and what we're still living through today as an emergency response, not an ongoing initiative or an ongoing concern like, privacy, legality, security. Those are ongoing issues that have been very, very well known across industries for decades, for I would even go as far as saying centuries. So, when it comes down to the world we're living in today, it's different than the world we were living in 14 months ago. And in the times of crisis, something that we've personally experienced at Vocalytics, we built a sound detection algorithm that passively monitors and listens in to ambient background noise. And we launched it a year ago. So in the very first phases of COVID, we built a cough detection model. And we had an unprecedented amount of responses to a survey that we launched on our website. When we were trying to build a proprietary data set and really have qualified coughs, we actually had people submitting so many responses to an organic survey we never spent any marketing dollars on at all. It was shared on a handful of mailing lists, and it was kind of word of mouth, honestly. And organically, we had people that were volunteering their coughs in order to really further the research and finding the nuances in what COVID is and how to prevent that spread of an illness, a disease that has been shown to rock the world a few different ways, more than a few different ways in just a year's time. So, for us, I think as individuals, and we're all individuals, whether you're a policymaker, you're a business owner or an employee, or you're just an individual, everyone's down to the individual nature of this because it affects everyone equally. So when it comes down to times of crisis, times of need, we're more willing to volunteer that privacy and volunteer your data in order to keep yourself protected. So I really think it comes down to a balance. It comes down to, timing and value. And it's a balance between the two while understanding the implications yesterday, today, and tomorrow of volunteering that information. So volunteering that information for us helps us to build a more proprietary and frankly a stronger data set to analyze coughing in real time and alert for real-time sanitation, even in the workplace or on campuses today, even just from a connected microphone device, and understanding that the whole purpose of that is to understand and sanitize, really quarantine those individuals in those spaces. And much like an air quality sensor, except it's just listening in for coughing in those moments as a return to work or return to school solution. so no one else is exposed to whatever contagions or pathogens have been expelled from an individual coughing in a given space. Sending out a real-time alert for sanitation and really just to flag janitorial and sanitize that space, isolate the individual, get them tested. That was really the purpose. I'll go back to my own personal family side of it is kind of the reason why we jumped in that direction and really leaned heavily in that direction. My little sister has a chronic illness known as Still's disease. She's highly, severely autoimmune. So we built this passive listening technology, and I wanted to find a way to keep her safe. So I think it's building with principles towards and understanding the value, also in terms of the timing of whatever you're solving for with those solutions as well.
Yeah, Van mentioned timing. I'd love to build on that. I think an important kind of intersection with timing is how we think about consent, and thankfully healthcare is one kind of place where we do actually have some protections for consent and privacy from the HIPAA law, at least in the United States. And so there's a little bit of structure there, which I think is positive. And I think thinking about how consent may change over time, right? So to Van's point, we're kind of in a crisis mode with this ongoing pandemic. People may be really open to sharing their healthcare kind of information right now if it helps with research, helps with solutions, helps get us out of this. In a couple years, when I hope this sort of pandemic phase is a distant memory, people might not want that information to be shared anymore. They might want the option to rescind their consent, right? And so I think we need to think about that as a data community to understand, are we building in mechanisms to accommodate that need from our stakeholders? Are we kind of thinking of consent as an ongoing practice that's sort of a contract between us and our stakeholders who are providing this data, and making sure that they have some say and control over what happens with their personal information. So that's just another layer I'd add in with the timing is consent.
Yeah, what's interesting is, we obviously we're in a data company here at Data 360. We have data on everything, and no, we don't know who all of you are right now. But we are, we have CCPA here, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which has very specific structures about opting in and opting out. But it's interesting because a lot of the legal agreements and a lot of different things say you can retain this data for legal purposes. So is there ever really an opt-out? Like, how do we explain to the public whether they really opted out or not? Is it, we have our answers at our company, how we opt people out, but I'm just curious about how would you feel comfortable? How would you explain to the public that they have the responsibility to say, I really need to be out of the system? Do you think there should be a constant advocacy towards that, or do you think there should be notices, or do you think there should be systems, or how does that work for your company, Van, for example, and in your practices with companies, Rachel?
Yeah, on my side for our company, we built Vocalytics, and actually dialing it back, I built my last company during the ages of GDPR. So 5, 6, almost 7 years ago now, when GDPR was first coming to light, we built a computer vision software and we were taking it to Europe. So understanding the privacy legislature around, we're not a data warehouse, we're a data processor, and the differences between the two. And then it's educating our clients as well that we are a data processor, but if your customers or your consumers or your users in that environment decide to opt out, it's your responsibility to remove their data without getting their consent. So what it really comes down to was building Vocalytics with a fundamental foundation of privacy in effect. So again, I'll go back to what I previously said. We've built a system that's essentially turning a connected microphone device into an air quality sensor. We actually don't recognize a unique user. We've actually been through United Healthcare's EIS security audits for data governance, as well as their speaking with their general counsel around privacy and legality around. And from the largest payer organization in the world, they've actually deemed us closer to an air quality sensor because we don't recognize unique users within a given space. It's that this is the activity, this is the behavior, frankly, this is the sound profile that was recognized in this given space. So even like in a care-driven environment, yes, absolutely, HIPAA exists. Even down in Brazil, there's LGPD, there's CCPA out here in California. Illinois has a new law. Every state's going to have their own, and they're all going to be very similar in nature, or it's going to be about opt-in and understanding of what data is actually being collected and what's being done with it. So, I'm pretty firm on saying we don't actually recognize a unique user. And in the rare case that a unique user, let's just say that there's speech going on in that environment, we actually don't do any transcription. And by all means, we welcome our customers in to audit our code base to say that we actually don't even have an ASR module. We don't do any kind of speech to text module and then run natural language processing. It's not that we couldn't, it's that frankly, we don't want to. So we leave our code pretty much open for our customers to review and ensure that it actually is legally compliant for our service to be providing that value in their environments. And so we'll label it as male speech, female speech, child speech, or whatever, with a start and a stop to those periods. And then we have the ability to actually redact that entirely from waveform, but not even before normalizing it. So even if a voice pattern, speech pattern, or something, a file or something right before it was intercepted in that moment, we actually normalize it so it can't actually be recreated to uniquely identify an individual as well. And then there's layers of redaction, of PII, PHI, PMI, all of that stuff is already baked into our system. It's really understanding those nuances in speech patterns less than the words themselves. So in a given environment, we're helping to understand when grandma may have fallen in a room in her senior living residence, when there's a bump or a thud, just as much as coughing, wheezing, heavy breathing may lead to that event occurring, or footsteps moving around at night. Understanding each one of those nuances is really just to protect, and we do it at such a great, in my opinion, it's such a granular, fantastic, privacy-centric focus around that we don't actually know if it's the caregiver or if it's a visitor or if it's that unique individual. If there's glass breaking in that room because someone dropped a coffee mug, we're not marrying that to a unique person. So because there's no identity involved, and there's actually no speech involved as well, it's just a sound that you heard at the end of the day. We recognize and we help to extrapolate value in terms of having immediate response, and then also classifying what that event was. Glass breaking, for example, if it's a caregiver walking into a residence in a senior living home, it's better for them to be looking on the ground for glass than it is to walk into the room and say, hey, what's going on?
Yeah, makes sense. Rachel, your thoughts?
Yeah, so Marie, you had kind of asked about, how should this look? We have CCPA. Van alluded to the fact that a lot of these laws are still being written. And I think that's absolutely true. We're about to see more kind of policy around this. And I think that this is a major area where the technology is far ahead of the policy. And so I think that puts this in an interesting position, because there's sort of this legal baseline, which I think is frankly a pretty low bar right now in most cases, for how data is handled and data practices. And so I certainly would like to see practices that go above and beyond what's legally required today. And I think future regulation will kind of help us get there a little bit. I think one common parallel that I see to this from another industry is thinking about the food industry and nutrition labels. And I think there's so many parallels here. So I think it's a helpful kind of analogy. In the days before a lot of Americans were eating a lot of processed food, there were no nutrition labels, right? There becomes this shift toward kind of a societal shift, right, towards more processed food. And there start to be these more concerns about kind of foodborne illness around kind of how people can protect themselves. And so those concerns lead to some kind of consumer advocacy and some government action that creates this kind of nutrition label concept, right? Which is, it's kind of a foundation. So it's really basic, right? It's you can buy really unhealthy food that has a nutrition label, right? It's not getting at any of those kinds of goals, but it's providing a foundational information to, say, protect people with food allergies, or to make sure that you're not selling milk that's weeks old, things like that. And so I think that that's a really interesting model, because it also builds customer trust. So thinking about Van's point, right, they're not transcribing speech because that's a way to help build customer trust and the privacy around their product. Same thing with nutrition labels. If any of us walked into the cereal aisle at the local grocery store and there's a brand of cereal there with no nutrition label, I would bet that everybody here would be pretty suspicious of that cereal and probably not buy it, because there's just some basic levels. If you're allergic to something, you don't know if that's in there, right? So that creates a good foundation. And as a foundation, it also kind of sets the stage for more kind of improved practices down the line. So once foods start being labeled with all of these things, you're like, man, there's a ton of preservatives in this. Then you start to see a kind of new companies or new product lines come out where they're saying, hey, this is preservative free, or hey, look, read our nutrition label. We've got 5 ingredients you can pronounce, like these, you start to see these types of movements, which I think in general are great for kind of health and thinking about healthy eating and public health and all that sort of stuff down the line. So to me, when I'm thinking about, Marie, to your point, how should this look? There's going to be a lot of answers to that. Some of it's going to depend on specific industry. I think that one way to kind of start is to get some kind of foundational industry standard across the board, some kind of nutrition label type of construct that helps us kind of be equipped to answer that question.
A standard disclosure. Yeah, makes sense. So one of the things that we found so interesting recently as we're building out our platform, AI, service platform, and we found that 90 million workers are technically illiterate, and 73% of businesses are technically illiterate. So how do we address the inequities and power imbalances within data and technology in work? And I'll start with Rachel on this one. How do we close the gap?
Yeah, Marie, I think there's so many dimensions here. Certainly as you're pointing out, there's this dimension between kind of who has access to technology and training and education and who doesn't, sort of within companies. I think that's absolutely a big piece of it. I think also what happens with the data, right? Who is data being collected on and why? Who is data not being collected on and why? Right? I think there's a lot of different angles of this as we think about inequities. Without getting too specific into any one thing, I think that a strategy that is really powerful across all of them has to do with asking good questions, right? So when we think about, for example, say a company where a bunch of workers are deemed, I think your term was technically illiterate, like I would love to have some good questions around that. Well, why is that? Well, has the company provided training to some workers and not others? Do these workers come from backgrounds where they weren't given access to educational opportunities? I think there could be so many underlying things there that you could get at with kind of a curiosity mindset and some kind of question asking. So I think that's one place to start. I have some resources, and I think they're going to be shared after this, and some links to a lot of questions around data specifically that I think can be a good kind of starter list as you're thinking about questions to ask. So that's one piece. And then I think the other piece is documentation, right? I think I have learned, as someone who's kind of tried to teach myself a bunch of different kinds of technology, is that some is made more accessible than others because it's well documented, right? If you try to learn, there's a bunch of programming languages out there you could try to learn. Some of them have great free tutorials online in their documentation, and some of them have incomprehensible technical jargon that no one who's not a total expert could understand easily. Right. And so those are you technically illiterate if you don't understand the latter? Like, I don't think so. I have a computer science degree and I've encountered technical documentation I don't understand. Right. So, I think that when we think about that definition, we have to think about what's being made available and how. And I think documentation can be a really powerful tool for that, both technical documentation, the disclosures we were just talking about. I think that can be a really useful approach.
Dan, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. What about the benefit? Sort of like, how can we, I know you and I have a certain feeling about technological companies, data companies being good. How do we teach people about the benefits of data and AI, not just the scary stories?
I think it comes down to, one thing that Rachel had mentioned was documentation. But documentation and even going beyond that can become more experiential just with content in general. I think that the more engaging the content, the more engaging the material, the mediums that it's posted on, whether it's Vimeo or YouTube, and actually watching a video versus trying to digest technical jargon potentially that could be written well or not. The quality in that production is the quality in that experience, is the quality in what's actually remembered, recognized, and learned ultimately at the end of the day. So beyond the I would say documentation or the content, I think it comes down to the delivery of the content, but also understanding that education is free. You can search on Google, and not that Google's the most private company that can be mentioned on a panel like this, but the power in Google isn't that you can find the answer to anything. The power in Google is that it can teach you how to ask the right questions, which really goes back to Rachel's point around asking the right questions, framing the right questions. You can find anything on Google if you're asking the right question. You can search the internet, maybe is a better way of phrasing that, and learn how to find anything if you ask the right question. So, and moving beyond that too, I think it really just comes down to access. Not everyone has access to the same tools, systems. The playing field is just frankly not even. If you look at, and I don't have the stats off the top of my head, but there's, I want to say probably 1 billion people in the world without access to internet. And so that's a severe discrepancy and disadvantage just on a global level. So yeah, I mean, first and foremost, it comes down to access. Secondly, it really comes down to the fact that once you have access to a tool like the internet, the education becomes free at that point. And if you can learn how to ask the right questions, and then it comes down to, once you ask the right questions, can you discover the right content to engage with that inspires you to create something special?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have a great point. It was one of our audience members said, documentation is generally bad. I think the interesting thing about addressing literacy is that our current tech paradigm hasn't closed the gap at all, right? So documentation is an issue, transparency is an issue, jargon is an issue, and it's, there's a lot of it that centers around power. So in terms of creating the government, right? Let's go back to them. What do you think the priorities should be? I mean, the interesting thing, I know when this question was first brought up to me, I laughed. And I laughed because I was recalling the senators who didn't know the difference between, they didn't even know what Facebook did. And they were asking him weird questions about some other software. I can't remember what it was. And there's so many, if you think about the government trying to regulate the internet, it is funny. How do we, is it a new generation of governing people who govern? What is it that will allow the government to access technology, first of all? And then once it's accessed, then how do the priorities come into play? Let's start with Rachel on that one.
Sure. Yeah, Maria, I feel like we've chatted about this a bit, and I'm certainly with you on, there's a long way to go in a lot of these areas. I think I already told you about my kind of nutrition label analogy. I think that would be a really powerful kind of action area for government, in part because it helps simplify some of the basic stuff, right? You do not need a lot of, deep education in food science to understand a nutrition label, right? I think to get some kind of basic safeguards, say, around the data that Facebook collects in an understandable, accessible format that's standard, I think would be a huge step in the right direction. And I also think that there is an opportunity for governments to kind of start to set examples of some of these things. Thinking about so many government agencies are starting to publish open data, open data portals. We're seeing these at the federal level, the state level, the local level, which I think is a really exciting movement. And so thinking about those data sets that are getting shared, thinking about how government agencies are using data, which they use a ton of data in their processes, right? We've seen this with all sorts of things that have been happening related to the pandemic and others. Starting to set an example of what are the best practices that we can be using to kind of be a leader in this space and help prevent, you know, the types of inequities that we sometimes are seeing, particularly in the private sector, but certainly not exclusively in the private sector. So, you know, I think that could be a really powerful place and kind of way to create some change. You know, certainly I think some technology acumen and skills being brought into kind of the public sector and the government space certainly is a positive move. I think there's a lot of kind of movement in that direction, though slow. I think it's happening, so I'd like to see more of that as well. But yeah, I think starting to set examples of, you know, governments that are a little bit further ahead on this idea is a great place to start.
So Ben, your thoughts?
Yeah, you know, and I really like the Rachel's example of nutrition labels. That's actually technically where those App Store privacy labels, that's kind of where the idea for them stemmed from. So I think it really comes down to, in my opinion, building a framework for those that do right policy to understand for a given data set to solve a given challenge. In order to do this, these are the risks associated. These are the potential benefits that they can maybe come up with, but really understanding what the risks are and analyzing data, but analyzing it in a certain way and applying it for a specific use case, understanding kind of even just from those three, and there's probably a few more buckets we could just craft here while we're on the panel, but not to dive too deeply. I think it's understanding what that framework is so they can start filling out, you know, the buckets that within that framework to have more of a holistic idea and an understanding of these are the potential risks, these are the potential benefits, and, you know, these are the potential challenges as well, whether it's in acquiring the data, processing the data, or you know, even visualizing or delivering the data as in terms of results. I think it comes down to defining what that framework is for those that don't understand the meaning of the word framework.
Yeah, makes sense. And then one last question is, what advice do you have for individuals that are interested in contributing their data skills, working in advocacy groups, ensuring their personal data or want to learn how to protect their personal data, and want to join in this kind of movement or business, whether it's on the advocacy side or the business side, the government side, the citizen side. What do you guys think about how do you advise someone to get involved?
I don't know, Rachel, you want to take that one first, or you want me
Yeah,
to
I'm
try
happy
to
to
dive in and unpack it?
yeah, I mean, there's so many ways, you know. I think on an individual level, especially for folks who are here tonight, I think one piece that's I think is really important is starting with kind of educating yourself around, especially on the data ethics issues side. There's a lot of kind of new and emerging content coming out around that right now. In particular, if anyone hasn't seen the film Coded Bias, it's now available on streaming. I think PBS, I think it's coming to Netflix. That's a great resource to kind of start understanding in a really accessible way, kind of some of these issues that we've been talking about tonight. And, you know, I think if you work with data in any capacity, just starting to put this stuff into practice, starting to think about, you know, man, if I'm starting to ask some of these, Van and I have both been talking about asking good questions of, you know, what are you using this data for? What are your practices? Are you collecting anything you don't need? Is there a way to not collect that stuff? Can you provide opportunities for consent, right? All these things we've talked about, you know, start trying to implement that stuff. I think that as we talked about, the legal frameworks aren't forcing us to do it yet. I think and hope that they will in the future. But until that time, I think it's kind of up to people who work with data to kind of start to be at the forefront of that stuff. So that's a big piece. And then I think there's also an advocacy angle. You know, like the folks who advocated for better labeling of food, they put a lot of pressure, public pressure that kind of helped make some movement on that front. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for advocacy around that. There's an organization called Algorithmic Justice League that has a lot of resources specifically about that. They're linked in my resource list that Katie put in the chat there. That's another place that I think people can really plug in.
So I probably don't have as lengthy of a response. I probably don't have as much meat around this one, but I would say it comes down to educating yourself, and it comes down to sharing what you've learned. Just with those two core fundamental, I'll call them pillars, to help to guide you in the right direction. It really guides you in the direction of getting involved. I've had a lengthy career, and I'm finally gotten to the stage over the last handful of years that I've been given the opportunity to express my opinions, and I'm fortunate to be joined with you today, and the audience today. But it really comes down to educating yourself and getting involved. It's not sitting around, it's not just watching, it's giving back as well. And one of the reasons why I really enjoyed our experience in going through Techstars as a family more than anything else is that is really what they stand for. They actually make you sign an actual agreement when you join that your policy becomes give first. So I really like that. I respect that. I can appreciate that. And I think if you're going to give first, a lot of it has to do with listening. And there's a little bit that has to do with sharing in there as well.
Interesting. And so for me, I would say for people getting involved, there's a lot of different answers. I think, it depends on what your goals are. I think the biggest thing is making sure that you, as Van and Rachel both pointed out, is you have good questions to ask, and you seek out questions. And then you also look for opportunities to learn. I think both of those are super important to have both of those points of view, is that you're really seeking out learning opportunities and you're asking great questions when they arise. And in all parts of your life, right? I mean, this is not, all parts of your life involve data. So there's not a point where data doesn't touch your life. So you really have to be circumspect about what's happening in your life. And so with that, I'll actually open up a few minutes early for questions. If you want to stick any questions in the chat. And then I have a few other questions if we don't have any questions from the audience. So go ahead and post your questions and we'll put them up to the panelists. Any questions? No? So Rachel, in terms of, and Van, in terms of this whole data business, tell us a little bit about how you got involved. How did that happen for both of you?
I can probably dive right into that. In terms of the data business, I've been a hobbyist as a technologist for most of my career. Up until the last 10 years, I kind of took the stab on that painful entrepreneurial journey, and have learned a ton in the process. How did I get involved? I got involved by asking questions to things I didn't know the answer to. And when I felt I had enough information and I might have an opportunity to pursue, whether it's a product or a business or a project even, I would pursue it, and I would either succeed or fail, or, really it's binary. It's one or the other. And for me, it was more so about, and I always like to bring in my brother into the conversation, much older and much wiser than I. He's a teacher and a coach, and honest to God, one of my heroes. And he's got all sorts of these micro philosophies. There's good days and there's learning days. To me, what's most important is those learning days, those opportunities to learn and to grow and to expand not just my knowledge, but who I am. So, how did I get involved? I got involved by asking questions. I got involved by trying to move quick and break things. I got involved by, hitting my head against the wall and realizing this wasn't as soft as I thought it was. Now let me find another way around. I think getting involved starts with asking questions. And I think you guys have done a fantastic job in asking some great questions today.
Thank you. Rachel, how did you get involved in all this data madness?
Wow, that was a great answer. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, maybe a little bit of an example of that. I sort of started my career in the public sector and nonprofit spaces, and I started to see the potential of what data could do, starting to use data platforms, starting to use that technology, having so much potential, but there really being a gap between just skills and resources in the nonprofit and public sectors, and kind of what I knew was possible with the technology. And so that was kind of what got me really interested with it. And so I started pursuing the technology side more, and I'm in this kind of constant quest to bring those two spaces together, because I think there's so much kind of untapped value there. The private sector has done a really good job of tapping a lot of that based on profit motive and all these other things that are sort of driving that. And I think being able to, since a lot of that's been built and a lot of the development is there, being able to kind of bring some of those ideas into the nonprofit and public sectors, I think is just so powerful. So that's something I'm really passionate about, and that's sort of what brought me here.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So how are commercial interests working against privacy concerns? I'll give that to Rachel first. I know she's cataloged that.
Yeah, I think this has a lot to do with motivation, right? So when you're saying the phrase commercial interests, I think I just said profit motive a minute ago, right? Like we think about how are companies motivated, right? And when we start to think about this with data practices, I bet for sure that every company knows how much they pay all their employees, right? Because that's money going out. That's really important to the bottom line. That's critical. I think every company doesn't know if they pay all their employees equally and fairly across gender and race, right? That's not that much harder of a question to answer if you already have the data I previously mentioned, but there's not a built-in incentive for them to do that analysis, right? Unless they're thinking of it from a, hey, one of our corporate values is equality. We're going to dedicate some resources to, once a year, we're going to do an audit and make sure we're paying everybody fairly. And if we find any discrepancies, we'll correct them.
Yeah, or there's some pressure.
Right. So absolutely. So yeah. So right now there isn't really much pressure around that. As you can tell from this, I think there should be more. Some companies are starting to do this a little bit. I think this is another area for consumer advocacy. So yeah, I mean, like everything else, again, like the food companies, didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we put nutrition labels on the box? Like that's not how it happens. Right. And so I think, they're still making plenty of money. Like they're still profitable. The CEO of, I don't know, what's a big food company, Kellogg, like it, is not going home hungry at night.
General Mills, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, I don't think that these things run counter to commercial interest necessarily. Like I said, I think nutrition labels help, in fact, build customer trust in a lot of ways. But I do think there needs to be some guidance of those interests, and this is where I think that government can absolutely play a role.
Yeah, absolutely. Van, any thoughts about that?
Agreed.
Commercial interest versus privacy. Agreed.
No, I think the only one piece that I probably have to add to that is, the diversity and inclusion data that exists has not been leveraged for such a long time. So I can't even comprehend how long that data has existed, and it hasn't been leveraged at all. I think it comes down to the public and finally standing up and finally demanding this in order for the CEO of Frito-Lay's or Pepsi or Kellogg's or Coke or any other food company to understand, or beyond food, Ford, it doesn't really matter, Intel, it doesn't really matter what company it is for them to really understand that now with this public pressure, now there is actually a commercial incentive for them to start digging up those data sets and becoming more diverse and inclusive. I think there's a lot of those initiatives that are, in my personal opinion, probably over marketed, that we are a diverse and inclusive company, and maybe they publicly post those stats, those data points. I think it's being overly leveraged, in my personal opinion, for commercialization and really for commercial interests. I also feel like the same way with ESG, the environmental sustainability goals, that are finally coming to light when that's about the environment and sustainability as a society, where it's social impact, really anything around those. I think it comes down to the level of transparency that you're able to get from the employer at the end of the day to really measure whether this is a commercial interest or if this is a tangible initiative that is fundamentally ingrained in the company's culture.
Yeah, to Van's point, I mean, actions speak louder than words. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also, I always, Rachel heard me say this, and I remember you pausing, but I said, there's got to be, our God can't be money. Our God has to be God, and money has to be money. It's a big, I think we have to change our focus as society a bit and balance it out. It can't be money at all costs. So we had a second question here. Can one individual's actions really make a difference? And what is the most impactful thing a single person can do? The most impactful thing, that's a big one.
I can take a stab at this. I mean, I think that really depends on who you are. If you are an entry-level data analyst versus if you're the chief data officer at your company, I think you can make some pretty different levels of impact, especially depending on things like how your company is structured. That said, I think there's something people can do at every level. If you're the data analyst and you're being asked to kind of look at some data that you think is really not a good data source, you're like, hey, like, why is this being categorized this way? I have a lot of questions about, was consent collected for this data set? I think you can start to pose those questions. Certainly you have a lot of structural challenges against you there, but those are steps that you can take. And if you have more leverage, I mean, as Van just made a comment about company culture, right? I think that's absolutely a place where if you're in a position to help shape that toward kind of a better direction around these topics, great, like, do it. I think that's huge, and that's a focus of some of the workshop programming we've been offering at LA Tech for Good lately. And so, there's resources like that. There's resources that we linked to kind of help you get there. But yeah, I mean, I think no matter what your role is, I think there are things that you can do.
I agree. And I'm gonna try and take this in a different direction real lightly. I think it really comes down to understanding how to be a great politician within a commercial environment. And what I mean by that is really just unwrapping this a little bit. Everyone, it doesn't matter what role you have in a company, whether you're CTO, CEO, VP of sales, customer success, it doesn't really matter what role you have. You could be an engineer at the lowest level or an intern. Everyone needs to have the ability to sell, because you're selling your ideas for the company, to the company, at whatever level. If you're a great salesman, and then you will likely have more influence or better influence in getting those ideas heard in front of the right people and having them become more a part of the company culture at the end of the day. So I think it becomes down to understanding that the motivation, intent, I would say, build EQ, build understanding of how to deliver your thoughts and value and communicate those to the right people at the right times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last question we're going to ask is, can panelists speak to the risk versus reward of consumers giving away their data in exchange for in privacy for free stuff and services? The free stuff factor. And will consumers ever be able to buy back their privacy? Can they end it once they give it away?
I can actually speak to that real quickly. There's a company, so I'm based down here right outside Newport Beach. And there's a company locally actually based in Newport that is one of the founders of Acorns. If you guys are familiar with the micro investing app, um, I've known the Crutendons for a while. They're very dear to me. And one of their businesses is called ATM.com, AMP Transaction Machines, for whatever reason is what it stands for. But ATM.com is built on precedence that you can literally link your Facebook or link your Google account or link whatever services that may request for your data in order for you to get free access to these services. You can link it to ATM.com. And that way, when Google requests your data, they're having to actually pay ATM, and ATM is paying you for your data. So you have more privacy, more, you're able to actually technically monetize your data. And the company hasn't had a single, I don't think they've spent any money on marketing, and there's lots and lots, I want to say hundreds of thousands of users already using it. So they're not the only one. They're definitely not the only player in that space where it's a pay to play. If you want to acquire me as a user, you're not just paying a marketing company to get me to click and to get me to subscribe to a mailing list or whatnot. It's that you're actually paying for me. Then the more and more I use your service, more and more you actually pay me for it, for my usage on your platform. So that model does exist. It is at its infancy right now, but I do foresee a future where, whether it's leveraging cryptocurrency or leveraging tokenization of information on a blockchain environment, I do see that being a part of our future very realistically in the next, I would even say, decade.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, what's interesting is in our community, we have, so we're all, almost at 300,000 users. Our platform has not been released. We've done no marketing except for social media. And, it's interesting, we'll probably be at 1 million to 2 million people in the next 12 months, just because people want to know how to utilize the data, what's it about, what data is available, how do I monetize it, how do I use it in my business, how do I use it for myself, how do I learn? It's been very, very interesting to see how many things are. And I don't know, I question a lot of times if privacy will exist in the traditional sense anymore, because people want to learn so much about what's happening out there. But I believe that those monetization models will definitely be interesting in the future. Okay, looks like we're at time. So thanks everyone for joining the event. Please take our poll and have a great, fantastic evening. I think we're at the end. Katie, how long are we gonna leave the poll up? We'll leave another 18 seconds, looks like. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Van, for joining us.
Thanks, Van. Thanks, Marie. Great to be here.
Thank you both, Rachel.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Have a great night. Please take the poll on your way out. Thanks, Mary.
All right. Well, I don't know about you all. I'm going to go grab some dinner, but it was great to be here, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Rachel. Have a great night.
Likewise. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.